This evening, I'm going to talk to you about one of the strangest books I know. It's a book which I've known for around 40 years and about which I've become increasingly obsessive. For me, The Box of Delights led to a fascination in the life and neglected works of its author, John Masefield. It's impossible for me to say just what Masefield means to me, but my words of advice are, if you're watching this and never read any Masefield, please quit right now. Nothing I've got to say can be as much fun as my source material. Switch this off and read The Box of Delights. You've got plenty of time to finish it in time for Christmas.
Now, assuming there's anyone left, I'd like to welcome you to the Annual John Masefield Society lecture in association with Darton, Longman and Todd. With my incredibly limited video editing skills, this is the style which I'll follow. Sections beautifully filmed by my generous colleagues at Sotheby's, and then strangely spliced passages. Please bear with me. I'd like to think that the content is interesting, even if the presentation is a bit rubbish. It's both a lecture as well as a virtual book launch.
Although this is a book launch, you'll have to provide your own warm white wine, or perhaps a posset. I'm going to talk for about an hour. After introducing the two K. Harker books, I'll turn to the writing of The Box of Delights itself. I'll touch on a bit of background research, the manuscript, production problems, the illustrator, and initial reception. I'll then very briefly look at a couple of interesting themes in the text: Seeking's House, Masefield's Christmas, the Spanish Main, possets, Christmas trees, model boats, and church bells. I'll then look at a few adaptations, and that includes, of course, the BBC TV series. The novelist L.A.G. Strong claimed that the K. Harker books are amongst the most sure-footed and robust books for children ever written, and The Times has called them two of the greatest children's books ever written. The writer Marjorie Fisher claimed that the books should be on every child's bookshelf.
Obviously, I'm a huge fan, but I'd like to suggest that the two K. Harker books are important. Long before the wizarding world of J.K. Rowling, there were the K. Harker books. Long before C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, there were the K. Harker books. And a few years before Tolkien introduced hobbits to children's literature, there were the K. Harker books. There were, of course, magical fantasies before Masefield, but in The Midnight Folk and The Box of Delights, children's literature entered a modern age of fantasy and ingenious invention.
Masefield had previously written 3 stories for children. All date from a time when Masefield was in a precarious financial position, and they were written to make money. Masefield started making money from poetry in 1911, and his writing of children's books abruptly stopped.
So why, over a decade later, did Masefield choose to write a new book for children? The answer lies in the autobiographical background. At times, K. Harker is John Masefield, and Sylvia Daisy Pouncer is Kate Masefield, his detested aunt and guardian. We know that Masefield started writing The Midnight Folk in 1925. The manuscript notes that he finished writing on the 15th of May 1927. This was a leisurely composition. Masefield was in no hurry. Why? Presumably, even Masefield, who loathed his Aunt Kate with a vengeance, realised that The Midnight Folk couldn't be published during her life. 1 month after completing the text, Aunt Kate died, and a few months later she was immortalised for all time as a witch. Of the 6 Masefield children for whom she had been guardian, 5 were still alive in 1925. Of these 5, 4 attended her funeral. The one who didn't was John Masefield. The Midnight Folk proved to be a success. There were limited editions both in America and England. A reprint was required, possibly before publication, and there was an illustrated edition. Masefield once noted, "One of the marks of happy invention in storytelling, or less often in playwriting, is the appearance of a sequel or succession." And so, just under 7 years after concluding The Midnight Folk, Masefield picked up his pen to tell another K. Harker story. In 1934, he hinted to his publishers that he was writing a book for children. They responded with enthusiasm, and the full typescript was in their hands by May 1935. As usual, it was the head of the firm, C.S. Evans, who was the first to read the new work. He wrote suggesting that Masefield had attained the status of J.M. Barrie or Lewis Carroll. During the weekend, I read with very great pleasure your new children's book, The Box of Delights. It is a delightful story, and I could not help thinking all the way through what a wonderful play could be based upon it, a play which might have the popularity and permanence of Peter Pan. The mixture of fantasy, poetry and adventure is extremely successful. Take note, before publication, the possibilities of adaptations of The Box of Delights were obvious.
There's one example of background research which I particularly want to talk about. There's another one in Opening the Box of Delights, but you'll have to buy the book for that one.
Long before the Weasley family's enchanted Ford Anglia flew through the pages of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, there was Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Yet both flying cars must owe something to the first flying car in literature, a car that became an aeroplane, as described by Kay. We could claim that Masefield's ideas for flying cars date back to the First World War. In 1918, Masefield was lecturing at an aviation camp. He was met by an airman who suggested a flight, Masefield's first. Masefield wrote about the experience a few months later. I climbed into my seat and was strapped in and was told not to monkey with the machinery, which was quite the last thing I ever thought of doing. For the first 100 yards or so, it was just like being in a motor car, but as we ran along the ground, the thing became alive. After the flight, Masefield described the landing, which he had expected to be a bump, but was not really more than a car would make in crossing a rut in a road. In that experience, the seeds were sown for Abner's fleet of flying cars. Another aspect of the Box of Delights required Masefield to ask for distinguished ecclesiastical help, but you'll have to buy my book for that one.
Masefield didn't look after his manuscripts. After his death, a London book dealer produced an inventory which noted that many of the papers were without coherence. Some, too, had been damaged by fire and flood, some by long exposure to damp. This material is now in the collection of the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Centre at the University of Texas.
The composition of the Box of Delights is typical of Masefield's working methods in the 1930s. There are sections in the author's autograph hand together with typewritten episodes. Both handwritten and typewritten sections show significant revision in places. As ever with Masefield's manuscripts, you get the sense of an expert wordsmith weighing each word with the precision of the poet. As was usual, Masefield carefully noted the date he started writing. This note is on a slip of paper that has become detached and trimmed. However, we know he started on the 24th of January 1934 between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. Masefield was probably working in his garden shed, as usual, for he also notes sparrows and that the weather was cold. Typical of Masefield to start writing his Christmas tale towards the end of January. Masefield would frequently rewrite sections and then stick these passages over the original text. The original manuscript has an occasional scrapbook appearance. Above all, on close inspection, the manuscript is a mess. There are a vast number of different drafts which don't slot together. The sequence at times is confused and confusing. This allowed me to rescue an unpublished episode from obscurity. Opening the Box of Delights includes a description of one of the rats showing Abner Brown round his submarine. It was cut from Masefield's draft, but for those who'd like a little more original box, it's now printed for the first time. Masefield took a mere 2 months to write the Box of Delights, although it was evidently a complex process. When he'd finished, he carefully noted the time, date and weather conditions as 5:36 p.m. Saturday 23rd of March 1935, stormy W. For someone so methodical about recording for posterity such details, it is strange that the manuscript should be such a jumble.
From the beginning, The Box of Delights was to be illustrated by Masefield's daughter, Judith.
The first Kay Harker story, The Midnight Folk, had originally been published without illustrations, but the publishers soon realised a need for drawings to accompany the text, and illustrations by Roland Hilder were first published in 1931. However, with The Box of Delights, Masefield chose his daughter as the illustrator. Although Masefield sent the typescript of The Box of Delights to his publishers accompanied by the illustrations, there was to be a significant problem. The publishers had simply failed to allow sufficient space for 2 of Judith Masefield's illustrations to be printed. Masefield therefore had a choice: delete text or dismiss 2 illustrations. Here's the problem at the end of chapter 9 and the problem at the end of chapter 10. Contrast this to the published version. Here's the revised version at the end of chapter 9 and the revised setting at the end of chapter 10. Evidently, Masefield chose to rewrite and cut his text. The Box of Delights was republished many times, but despite resetting, Masefield's original version was not restored. Even when Judith Masefield's illustrations were abandoned, the original version was forgotten. Over 7 decades later, I worked on a new text by consulting the original manuscript and the book proof. It was only in 2008, therefore, that readers could appreciate that the inspector's abrupt dismissal of Kay's ideas wasn't originally so hasty. We also learn about Kay's concern for Arnold Toady and his attempt to provide nourishment in the guise of some meat, some bread and a chunk of cheese, and also, crucially, 2 mince pies. Beyond the additional minor embellishments to the story, these 2 examples give an insight into Masefield's revision of his work. Faced with the need to cut text, he could provide neat and concise excisions. I personally prefer the earlier, original text. Compare the original departure of Arnold of Toady. He slipped through the wicket gate and was gone. I feel it's more poetic than the bald statement, he was no longer there.
The English edition of the book was first published on the 30th of August 1935. There were 7,500 copies and they sold for 7 shillings and 6pence.
The odd thing about the English publication is that, apart from Judith's dust jacket, there is nothing to warn contemporary readers that it's a book for children. The book itself was issued in the publisher's standard dark blue cloth with gold lettering, and the dust jacket fails to carry any blurb. The American edition of the book was published on the 6th of November 1935 at $2.50. This edition did include blurb on the dust jacket announcing more exciting adventures of Kay Harker and summing up with an unusual fantasy by the great English novelist. Reviews started to appear on the first day of publication. The review in the Times found the tale all wildly impossible and easily credible. The Manchester Guardian had concern about the dream ending, but described the book as a rattling good story. The Daily Telegraph, on 3rd of September, decided that the book had just the right touch and true ring of extravaganza that demands the real imagination of genius to achieve. Some of the reviews in the regional press were even more admiring. The Liverpool Daily Post on the 18th of September stated that if anyone writes a better Christmas book than Mr. Masefield's, it will be a miracle.
Whilst the original English edition was reprinted in the 1950s, 60s, 70s and 80s, there have also been a significant number of other editions. To an extent, they reflect the publishing styles of their respective eras. Let's have a quick look at some of the other editions.
The Puffin paperback first appeared in 1965. This was the first appearance of the book in paperback. The front cover incorporates several of Judith's original illustrations with a contemporary 1960s design twist. The Box of Delights was first issued in an educational series in 1958, although Masefield didn't approve of such things. By 1982, the front cover gave a lurid impression of the book's contents. The second paperback edition was published by Piccolo in 1976. It features an illustration by Julia Fryer. With the BBC television adaptation in 1984, there were TV tie-in editions in paperback for both England and America. Fontana Lyons published the English edition, and the American edition was published by Dell. In 1994, the paperback edition from Mammoth opted once more for a front cover representing the wolf attack. The artist was Kevin Tweedle. The Box of Delights was again rebranded, this time as a classic Mammoth, in 2000. Cover illustration here is by Liz Pyle. There are 2 different paperback editions, including artwork and lettering from the legendary Quentin Blake. And finally, in 2012, this hardback saw the book marketed as a heritage classic in a list of heritage classics to cherish forever. Once again, the novel's subtitle provides an uncredited illustrator with inspiration.
I suspect that if you're in your 40s and you first read The Box of Delights as a child, you'll have recognised the 1984 paperback. For me, it's a disappointing book. It's the time that Masefield was a bestseller, but it's also the time that his beautifully crafted prose was savagely cut.
The well-respected translator Patricia Crampton was commissioned to condense both The Midnight Folk and The Box of Delights. Asked about the task, she saw her job as chopping, not changing, the text. The Box of Delights was edited with close attention to the BBC script. When the script differed from Masefield's original, Crampton noted it would have been wrong to introduce anything that was not already there, even when the film script differed very slightly from the book. Crampton stated that cuts came in three main varieties: descriptions, lists, and dialogue. Crampton's texts are competent examples of condensing literary works, but they're also sometimes a little heavy-handed, not understanding some of the intricacies of Masefield's plots and relationships, and frequently destroying Masefield's wonderful, if complicated, prose. It's a shame that when Masefield's big moment in the media spotlight arrived, the version of The Box of Delights that everyone read wasn't entirely his. Today, as mentioned earlier, there's a new edition available in both the UK and the US. The edition available in the UK even has illustrations by Quentin Blake. With mention of a distinguished illustrator, it's time to look at the original illustrations.
Isabel Judith Yates Masefield was John Masefield's daughter. She was the original illustrator of The Box of Delights, and for decades hers were the only illustrations for the book. Today, they are her remaining claim on posterity.
In 1921, Judith illustrated King Cole, one of her father's long narrative poems. In 1922, she added drawings to a poem entitled The Dream. However, interviewed in the 1970s, Judith lamented her artistic abilities and thought she was always an amateur. To be a professional artist, you must work steadily, not just 2 or 3 hours a day, but 6, 7, 8. Nevertheless, her father had been enthusiastic and described her as a pucker artist. Judith produced 26 illustrations in black ink for The Box of Delights, or 30 if we count individual panels within single pieces. They were drawn on thick artist's board and corrected with white gouache. The originals are much larger than the printed versions, and Judith's inexperience is highlighted in this respect. When significantly reduced in size for publication, the detail in the original is lost and tends to become a blobby mess. Judith also designed the dust jacket. The original drawing uses coloured inks with corrections in white gouache and is in the collection of the Toronto Public Library. It shows 29 vignettes, together with lettering panels within scrolls. This design was used in 1935, and with a few changes to colours and the removal of illustrations on the flaps, it was reused in 1957, 1958, 1962, 64, 68, 77 and 1985 by Heinemann. The vignettes were also adapted for end papers for the first English and American editions. Of course, printed end papers are expensive, and they were soon dropped. Opening The Box of Delights has a new design using Judith's originals, and in my modest opinion, the end papers are alone worth the price of the book. After Judith, illustrators included Faith Jakes, famous as one of the first illustrators of Roald Dahl, Quentin Blake, who needs no introduction, and Sarah Ogilvie, whose work was published by the Folio Society. Having looked at the book itself, now let's turn to some interesting topics or themes in The Box of Delights, starting with Kay Harker's home.
For at least a few years, the childhood of John Masefield was all about death and moving house. The death of his parents and grandparents caused the 6 orphaned Masefield children to move between 3 different houses in Ledbury. It was the last one, the Priory, which was the inspiration for Seekings in The Midnight Folk and The Box of Delights.
The Priory had been the home of Masefield's grandparents, and Masefield remembered it as a very, very old house, full of passages, corridors, strange rooms, strange noises. It was just as my grandfather had left it, a strange, dark, uncanny place, with rooms never opened and cupboards and secret chambers. Living there, I came to find life rather a nightmare, yet a romantic nightmare, especially at dusk. When Kay goes to bed at the beginning of The Midnight Folk, this sense of a strange, dark, uncanny place is evident. Now it became darker, so he could see a few stars. Footsteps passed in the house, sometimes close to his door, so that the gleams of candlelight crossed the ceiling. Very strange creaking sounded in the house. There were scutterings to and fro, and scraping scratchings. Despite the important role of Seekings in The Midnight Folk, it is mentioned by name only 6 times throughout the novel, of just under 70,000 words. By contrast, Seekings is named 60 times in The Box of Delights, a longer work of just under 88,000 words. Seeking's house is first mentioned in The Box of Delights in an unsettling way. Kay is on the train home from school in the first chapter. He is sharing a compartment with Joe and Charles and is beginning to distrust them. Joe suddenly asks him the question, "And do you keep dogs at Seekings, Mr. Harker?" The reader who has read The Midnight Folk knows where Kay lives, but not why Joe should know too. The reader who is new to the Kay Harker novels is informed that the question is unsettling for Mr. Harker. Kay jumped, for how did the man know his name and home? Kay therefore confronts his questioner and asks, "How did you know about me?" The response is even more unsettling. Magic, no doubt. It's so unsettling that it featured in the trailer for the BBC adaptation. Let's take a quick peek.
Do you keep dogs at Seekings, Mr. Harker?
How do you know my name and where I live?
Aha.
Magic?
Coming back to Seekings, when Judith Masefield drew a house for her illustration at the end of Chapter 8, it was undoubtedly based on the Priory in Ledbury. Today the Priory still stands, although since the 1960s it has been converted into flats. The imposing church is at the end of the garden, and on another side of the property the offices of Masefield Solicitors, the family firm which dates back to the 1830s. They're still in use. Let's turn briefly now to the setting of the book at Christmas.
In Chapter 1, Kay excitedly says, "I say, I do love Christmas." It was a sentiment shared by Masefield. But what of Masefield's own Christmases?
There are few references to Masefield's own childhood Christmases, and certainly no clues about those during his early childhood. However, there are a few suggestions about Christmas under the guardianship of Uncle William and Aunt Kate. In 1910, Masefield explained about his guardians in a private letter. "They administered my father's estate and took money from it for what they did to us. They paid themselves very well for all they did, though my aunt never ceased to tell us of her charity to us. Charity. They charged us poor orphans for the very Christmas toys they gave us." Aunt Kate came from a religious background. Her family were vicars for several generations. Masefield's grandfather, on his mother's side, had been a rector, and Christmas would undoubtedly have been spent in church. But how did the adult Masefield celebrate Christmas himself? It appears to have been an occasion for early rising, walks, bonfires, and naturally presents. Writing to his sister Nora in an undated letter, Masefield noted, "I always try to keep all opening of packets until the Christmas morning, just before dawn." But Christmas for the adult Masefield was not, it appears, a time of religious reflection and church attendance. Despite his interest in dramatising biblical stories, Good Friday, the trial of Jesus and the coming of Christ, for example, Masefield was not religious. Above all, Christmas was a time for fun. In the late 1950s or early 1960s, Masefield requested some Christmas cards from a shop. He returned several, saying they were somewhat gloomy for Christmas. In an undated letter to his sister Nora, Masefield wrote, "I hope that you will have a most happy Christmas and New Year with lots of fun. We have sent off a little packet of delights to you." It's no coincidence that the magical box in Masefield's novel should contain delights. There is, however, a sense of Masefield having been denied the fun and delights of a childhood Christmas himself. One can always find Masefield inserting episodes or themes which are important to him. Another such is the Spanish Main.
Tales of pirates and the Spanish Main were in Masefield's blood. Rat has spent his time between The Midnight Folk and The Box of Delights on the Spanish Main under the Scarland Crossbones, and pirates will feature heavily in the book. For Masefield, Tales of Pirates were one of his chief delights.
Masefield's first 2 published books were volumes of poetry. His third was a collection of short stories, and his fourth was a historical account of sea life in Nelson's time. Having hit upon the idea of writing naval histories, his fifth book was On the Spanish Main. The printed dedication to this book is to Jack B. Yeats, and the two men thrived on tales of piracy and the Spanish Main. They devised tales of Theodore, a pirate cabin boy, and his love for the beautiful Constanza. Pirate ballads spilled from Masefield's pen, and the subject would be used by Yeats in some of his oil paintings and drawings. The two men even devised a pirate code which was used in private correspondence and occasionally in print. In Yeats's book A Little Fleet, he described Masefield as a poet who had been a pirate, I expect. Around this time, Masefield had all manner of publishing schemes relating to pirates and the Spanish Main. In December 1905, he suggested to his publishers a series of buccaneer and pirate voyages, and a year later was asking his agent to try the pirate series on some historical and literary magazine. But Masefield had always known that his romantic dreams could prevent a serious literary reputation. As early as 1900, he'd written to his godmother, "If I could only abstain from my romantic dreams of John Silver, the Spanish Main, and all the tropic island palm tree business, I think I might succeed by and by. Anyhow, I am trying." Ultimately, Masefield did succeed in turning away from the Spanish Main, but it did occasionally return. The exploits of the wolves of the Gulf in the Box of Delights are part of this merriment. It's no accident that Abner calls them his merry mariners. Another joy, and one that viewers of the BBC TV series will recall, is the posset.
A posset, as defined by the OED, is a drink made from hot milk, curdled with ale, wine or other liquor, flavoured with sugar, herbs, spices, etc., and often drunk for medicinal purposes.
It is the Inspector of Police who suggests that Kay takes a strong posset every night at the conclusion of Chapter 5 of the Box of Delights. He then provides the recipe. For generations now, these instructions are immortalised in the delivery of James Grout.
A posset is a jorum of hot milk, and in that hot milk you puts an egg, and you puts a spoonful of treacle, and a grating of nutmeg, and then you stirs 'em well up, and then you gets into bed, and you takes it down hot.
When Maria Jones has returned to Seekings after her ordeal with Abner, she decides to seek comfort with a posset featuring an alcoholic ingredient omitted by the Inspector of Police, but undoubtedly a component of early recipes. "I'm not going to drink any poison like cocoa, thank you," Maria said. "When one's had a nervous strain such as I have, one wants a posset with 3 fresh eggs in it and a spoonful of sherry." They went into the larder and found a nourishing meal after Maria's own heart. Then Jemima and Susan took her to bed and gave her a posset. The Inspector of Police and Lady Macbeth seem to share a recipe book, although the latter obviously uses hers for a darker purpose. In Act 2, Scene 2 of Macbeth, Lady Macbeth states that she has poisoned King Duncan's grooms.
"I have drugged their possets. The death and nature do contend about them, whether they live or die."
Masefield knew the Scottish play extremely well. His amateur dramatics group, the Hill Players, performed the tragedy twice. Masefield played the second witch in these productions. 10 years after publication of The Box of Delights, Masefield wrote a Macbeth production, detailing his thoughts on staging the play. His ideas on Act 2, Scene 2 include: "For an instant, the stage must be empty. Then, could you not contrive the chirping of crickets? Then a sudden collapsing of a log in the fire, with perhaps a puff of smoke blowing into the stage, and a silencing of the cricket's cry? Upon this silence, let Lady Macbeth come forward from the right back as a very terrible creature, drunken with blood and posset, and exultant in sin." Masefield was not the only 20th century writer to refer to possets in children's literature. C.S. Lewis, in The Silver Chair from 1953, has the Queen of Harfang request that Jill Pole be given all you can think of, possets and comfits and caraways and lullabies and toys, and a steaming sweet and delicious posset is given to Sylvia Green as she arrives at Willoughby Chase in Joan Aiken's The Wolves of Willoughby Chase from 1962.
In Chapter 2 of The Box of Delights, Kay and the Jones children are invited to a party by the bishop, who explains he is having a children's party with a Christmas tree at 5 o'clock. What, we wonder, is so remarkable about a Christmas tree? Was this really a big attraction to children in 1935?
During research for opening the Box of Delights, I discovered an illuminating fact from contemporary local newspapers. Under the title of Christmas Day at Ledbury Workhouse, the Hereford Journal reported in 1889 the Christmas celebrations for the inmates of the local workhouse. Special decorations were provided and roast beef and plum pudding were served. In the afternoon the men were given tobacco and the women were presented with snuff. The day concluded with plays, music and a special Christmas letter for each inmate. A Christmas tree was promised for the 2nd of January 1890. Why would any of this have come to the attention of the 11-year-old John Masefield? Was he aware of a large Christmas gathering with the future promise of a Christmas tree? Possibly. The Christmas letters were provided by the Christmas Letter Mission through the local secretary. The local secretary was Mrs. William Masefield, or, as we may think of her, of course, Sylvia Daisy Pouncer. The bishop's Christmas tree is described by Masefield in great detail in Chapter 6. One of Masefield's distinctive narrative devices is to employ long lists. Masefield simply throws detail after detail at his reader. We learn that the bishop has the biggest and most glorious Christmas tree that has ever been seen in Tatchester. Masefield goes on to describe the boughs of the tree laden with gifts. Despite a number of gender-specific toys, toy boats are appropriate for both boys and girls. It's therefore time to look at Masefield's fascination with model boats.
Writing in his autobiographical memoir, So Long to Learn, Masefield recalled games he played as a child.
Sometimes I was taken on a mudlark up the mill stream, dressed for the occasion in my oldest clothes and strongest boots. Passing under the viaduct, I came to that water as it ran through a pasture turned up into red heaps by multitudinous moles. Here, for hours, one could sail homemade boats down the stream, prodding them with sticks as they stuck, and getting filthy and happy beyond easy description. In Chapter 6 of The Box of Delights, Masefield uses the same phrases. We'll go for a mudlark. We'll get out all our ships and sail them on the floods. And when 4 of Abner's gang arrive, Jemima originally thinks they're probably mole catchers coming to set traps over these fields now that the moles are working on the soft earth. Mudlarks and moles evidently went together in Masefield's mind. Even the 25-year-old Masefield enjoyed playing with homemade boats. In 1903 he stayed with Jack B. Yates in South Devon, and the two men spent days with boats on the River Gara. In later life, Masefield would occasionally construct models of ships. An obituary in Ship's Monthly for ship lovers and ship modellers declared, "The prize-winning cadet who became poet laureate could have swept the board at any exhibition of ship models." 3 model ships made by Masefield are known to survive. The Triumph dates from 1921 and was presented to Hardy. In the life of Thomas Hardy, Florence Hardy recalled that model was much valued by Hardy, who showed it with pride. Another model, of unknown date and name, was kept by Masefield and displayed on top of his main bookcase. In this location, it features in many photographs of Masefield. Recently restored, it's now located at the John Masefield Care Home, built on the site of the poet's final residence near Abingdon. A third model was made for W.B. Yeats and, recently discovered, was sold at auction in 2017. That model took Masefield many months to build. A letter from Masefield to Yeats notes, "I am hard at work on your brig. She is much the best model I have done, but of course I am a poor craftsman, and she won't be any great shakes." Another example of Masefield writing about his own interests in the Box of Delights are his references to church bells.
Bells were important to Masefield. In one of his Ledbury childhood houses, the imposing church of St Michael and All Angels lay just over the garden wall. The regular striking of the church bells would have been audible day and night.
I have mentioned something of the intense, strange feelings roused in me by the church. At a very early age I felt the beauty of its mystery and its link with eternity. More than I can describe, I loved its voice, the magical great musical voice of its bells that chimed at every third hour by day and night, that rang such glorious peals on occasions. One of Masefield's early poems, St. Mary's Bells, is a fine example of Masefield giving characteristics to the different sounds of bells. Let's get the wonderful Ronald Pickup to read this extract.
It's pleasant in Holy Mary by San Marie Lagoon. The bells they chime and jingle from dawn to afternoon. They rhyme and chime and mingle, they pulse and boom and beat, and the laughing bells are gentle, and the mournful bells are sweet.
In the Everlasting Mercy, after 3 long hours of gin and smokes, the drunken Saul Cain begins to question his life on hearing the church bells. The clock struck 3, and sweetly, slowly, the bells chimed holy, holy, holy. In the Box of Delights, as Kay and his friends emerge from Abner's dungeons, we are aware of victory over evil. There is also the realization that the 1000th Christmas ceremony at Tatchester Cathedral might yet be saved. The stillness of a crowd standing in a vast snow scene will soon turn into a race against time, kindled by hope. It is here that Masefield introduces the sound of bells ringing across the countryside, providing a sense of immediate time, but also tradition. The night was so still that they, standing there in the snow, could hear the bells of 9 churches ringing for Christmas. The precentor, who had been a curate in that district, told Kay which village each bell belonged to. "That one," he said, "with the tenor bell that needs recasting is Naunton Crucis. Old Father Goodman has rung that bell for 49 Christmas Eves, and this is his 50th. It is the silence of the bells of Tatchester Cathedral that arrests us in the final pages of the Box of Delights. "Ah, there, listen now," one of the cathedral bell ringers said to Kay. "Christmas Eve, near midnight, and no bells ringing in the cathedral. No, not one. Those are only St. Margaret's and St. Wincom's. I never thought to hear so unchristian a silence. Never." The idea that bells might be silenced affected Masefield deeply. Ledbury's Church of St. Michael and All Angels has 8 bells dating back to 1690. In the early 1950s they fell into disrepair, and an elderly Masefield sprang into action and began fundraising. Now, almost 70 years later, another costly repair of the bells has taken place, and Masefield's name has been remembered once again in this context. Having looked at a few of Masefield's favourite preoccupations, let's turn now to an essential part of the Box of Delights, the story of its different adaptations.
Children's Hour was the centrepiece of the BBC's radio broadcasting for children over 4 decades, and their stories, or dramatised stories, were extremely popular. But there had long been a feeling at the BBC that Masefield's Kay Harker stories were just simply too difficult to adapt.
Then, in 1942, a 17-year-old Robert Holland was suggested for the project. The BBC was a little nervous, however, and Masefield was contacted. "We are quite prepared for you to say you hate the very idea, and equally that you think the adaptation very poor. On the other hand, we should very much like to try to give our children this delightful story." Masefield responded, noting that Holland had made a prosperous opening. Then, in writing more of the script, Holland decided to reject Masefield's dream ending. Masefield was not impressed and objected. Although a swift rewrite restored the author's original ending, Masefield was still unhappy. When the BBC contacted Holland, it was discovered that he had joined the RAF and been sent overseas. It therefore fell to John Keir Cross, one of the established writers for Children's Hour, to complete and revise the script. Keir Cross found that with suitable music and acoustic effects, he could create a workable script, and, with final approval from Masefield, the production was scheduled for broadcasting in 6 episodes between 12th of November and 17th of December 1943. Broadcast during the blackout and appealing to huge quantities of evacuated children, the wartime broadcast of A Christmas Tale where good is pitted against evil had an effective resonance. 30 years later, the personal column in the Sunday Times included an appeal from someone hoping to contact others who remembered the unforgettable experience. There was, however, one potential listener who missed out. Robert Holland tried, but failed to hear the broadcast on a receiver in South Africa, where he was then stationed with the RAF. He wrote, "Out in South Africa, the Box of Delights almost became my symbol for a world of the imagination left far behind."
The magic of the Box of Delights had begun on radio in 1943, and the same script was used again in 1948 and 1955. If the cast lists, as printed in Radio Times, can be used as evidence, it appears there may have been some fluidity and evolution in the scripts.
Such was the apparent popularity of the serial that during Request Week in April 1949, listeners asked for the Box of Delights. Any unsuspecting listeners tuning into the BBC Home Service on the 7th of April 1949 between 5:15 and 5:55 p.m. must have been very surprised to have heard A Christmas Tale. By the 1960s, the Box of Delights had acquired a loyal following on the radio. A new version was required, and John Keir Cross therefore produced a script described as being freely dramatised for radio. This 1966 version was a single Saturday night theatre broadcast lasting 90 minutes. As with all previous broadcasts, it was not preserved in the BBC sound archives, but off-air copies do survive. Let's hear a brief passage now.
And how shall I ever describe that magical journey of that unforgettable Christmas Eve? We soared into the very heavens, the little unicorn hooves striking sparkles out of the air. The shining snowy country spread out far below us, starred by the lights of the villages, and the river gleamed where it caught the moonlight. And as we went, we all fell silent. And now we were down from the heavens, and skimming over the feathery snow itself, piled high in the narrow lanes after the great storm. All the church bells of all the parishes were ringing. The tremblings of their music went thronging by in the swift air. We saw the great pinnacled tower of the cathedral, all floodlit for this splendid 1000th night. And in the square, a mighty multitude was gathered. Among them, the red and white ranks of the famous Thatcher Regiment, the Thatcher Toms.
First broadcast on the 24th of December 1966, it is possible that Masefield could have heard the last large-scale broadcast of his work before he died less than 5 months later. The 1966 production was recorded and repeated in 1968 and 69. It was now a staple of Christmas broadcasting. Despite the freely dramatised aspect, the script is an increasingly breathless contraction of the plot, although using a grown-up Kay Harker as the narrator enables some swift transitions. The compression of the plot, however, is nothing compared to the next version. In 1974, the novelist and scriptwriter Howard Jones tried his hand at a 55-minute adaptation. Jones decided to bring a character, omitted by previous versions, to the fore. With Arnold of Toady as the narrator, this version was broadcast on the 21st of December 1974. It's an interesting experiment, but not a particularly successful one, and when the BBC decided to broadcast The Box of Delights again in December 1977, they returned to the freely dramatised script by John Keir Cross. In the 1980s, of course, the novel moved on to TV, but in the mid-1990s, it returned to radio. A writer of film, television, stage and radio plays, John Peacock provided the script for 2 90-minute episodes, and BBC Radio treated listeners to a lavish cast. Donald Sinden as Abner Brown, Lionel Jeffries as Cole Hawling, Celia Imrie as Sylvia Daisy Pouncer, and Spike Milligan as Arnold of Toady. This was an entirely new adaptation which dispensed with many of the features of previous versions. One of those features was the use of Healy Hutchinson's music.
Victor Healy Hutchinson was a composer and conductor who had studied under Adrian Boult. In 1926 he joined the BBC, and later, after a decade in academia, he returned in 1944 as the BBC's Director of Music. For many, an extract from his work, The Carol Symphony, is the soundtrack to The Box of Delights, and the piece has been used in all but one of the radio adaptations.
Let's remind ourselves of the magnificent opening of the BBC adaptation. Robert Stevens, who played Abner Brown, stated that he only agreed to be in the television adaptation on condition they agreed to use the music he remembered from the radio adaptations. The original manuscript of the symphony is now in the British Library, and it contains deletions and corrections in both black and red ink. Overall, it's a comparatively clear score, and suggests that Healy Hutchinson found the composition easy, or at least straightforward. It was originally entitled A Christmas Symphony, and that title remains unrevised on this first page. The first concert performance in London was given, unseasonably early, at a Queen's Hall BBC Prom on the 26th of September 1929 by the Henry Wood Symphony Orchestra. The composer conducted on this occasion, and one review noted that the composition had skill and resource, with a continuous vivacity, and another that the work is extremely well turned out. In contrast, Benjamin Britten once heard the beginning of the work and described it in his diary as utter bilge. Healy Hutchinson, together with the Royal Opera House Orchestra of Covent Garden, recorded an abridged version of the piece, entitled Noel Fantasy, on a single HMV 78 RPM in 1930. Here's an extract of that recording as the composer conducts what would become the soundtrack to the Box of Delights. In a strange way, the Carol Symphony received royal approval. For Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's Christmas broadcast in 1984, the same year as the BBC TV adaptation, selected scenes from the royal year were accompanied by the theme tune to The Box of Delights. Is the Queen a secret fan? And so, after the radio adaptations and brief mentions of the music, we arrive at the 1984 BBC TV adaptation.
The first approach from the BBC to make a TV adaptation of The Box of Delights was received by the Masefield estate in the late 1970s. There was competition from Hollywood, but the BBC eventually won and started work on their most expensive children's serial to date.
In 1984, the head of BBC Children's TV, Edward Barnes, had a budget of £12 million a year, and he committed 1/12 of his funds, noting, "I desperately wanted to make it, though there were many other calls on the budget." The series was to be co-financed with Leather, an American independent Christian production company who provided £135,000. With finance in place, a script was required. The Australian playwright and author Alan Seymour had been employed by the BBC from 1974 to 1981 as a script editor and producer. Now, as a freelancer, he adapted Masefield's novel into 6 half-hour episodes. Many flights of fantasy were abandoned due to technical limitations, but Seymour found the BBC keen to keep some challenging sequences. Next came the director. Rennie Rye had previously worked with the producer of the series, yet he expressed excitement and horror when confronted with the script. He recalls that when he read that Kay, riding a white pony, should be pursued by wolves, and then, approaching an Arthurian camp, they should take off and fly through the air, sailing effortlessly, he concluded they were mad. In September 1983, Paul Stone, the producer, informed Television Today that "we expect to cast established actors in the major roles and possibly some well-known names." A former Doctor Who, Patrick Troughton, was Cole Hawlings, and respected Shakespearean Robert Stevens became Abner Brown. A 12-year-old Devon Stanfield was cast as Kay. There was some considerable research into new video effects in order to realise magical sequences. Filming started on the 23rd of January 1984 with outside location work and concluded on the 25th of September with a studio session. The filming had contended with appalling weather conditions, strike action and last-minute illness from Devin Stanfield playing Kay. Music was by Roger Lim of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, and animation sequences were provided by Ian Eames of Timeless Films. The animation sequences were, according to Eames, in a semi-realistic style. It's a bit Disney. Bambi, for example, is such an amazing film. I think I reference that, really, setting the animals in beautiful, painted, scenic environments. By August, Leather Productions had sold the serial to 215 public broadcasting service stations in America. As Christmas 1984 loomed, it was time to launch pre-broadcast publicity.
John Bird of Leather Productions remarked in an interview during filming that today I think a 305-page book is rather difficult for children to read, which is why the publishers have agreed to print an abridged version. It was with the abridged version that the publicity machine started.
Before the end of the summer holidays, Fontana Lyons had issued a poster to bookshops advertising a sparkling winter's tale of wonder, magic and danger. Next came adverts for the Radio Times.
From the fantastic to the magical and the box of delights, a startling story of good and evil. Patrick Troughton is the personification of good, and Robert Stevens has evil designs on his magic box.
For it will give me power. Power over all.
Trusted with the box's safekeeping, young Kay Harker enters a mysterious world of magic, and Radio Times explains how it's brought to life on the screen. When the wolves are running, who knows what might happen? The answers lie inside the box of delights and the new Radio Times.
And so, the Radio Times for the 17th to the 23rd of November 1984 devoted the front cover to Devin Stanfield staring into the box of delights. And then the trailers for the series started.
In my box are such delights.
Starting on Wednesday on BBC One, a new serial for viewers young and old, The Box of Delights, a thrilling tale of magic and mystery, fabulous animals and villainous rogues.
Kay! Please come and save me! Kay!
They want my box of delights that I showed you at the inn. Will you keep it and see that they never get it?
The young hero, Kay Harker, travels in time and space into new worlds of the imagination.
Hey, are you coming into my wild wood?
Yes, please.
Now, be a stag in the wild wood with me.
John Masefield's classic story brought vividly to life in a spectacular new drama serial starring Patrick Troughton, Robert Stevens and James Grout. The Box of Delights, on Wednesday at 5 o'clock on BBC One.
The first of 6 episodes was broadcast on BBC One on the 21st of November 1984. It was a weekly broadcast, with the final part broadcast 5 days after the penultimate episode in order to coincide with Christmas Eve. Blue Peter played an important role in publicity too. There were 2 features. Firstly, 3 cast members were interviewed, and then, a few weeks later, there was even a biographical feature on Masefield himself. Both features would make an appearance in the Blue Peter Annual for 1985. The American broadcast took place during the month of December. These were double episodes and were shown at an adult-friendly time of 8 p.m. Reviewing the first episode in The Times, Peter Ackroyd made an astute prophecy that the series may well be one of those children's programmes which become a cult for adults. He also noted it can hardly fail to be a powerful success. Success was recognised when the series was nominated for 5 BAFTAs and won 3, Best Children's Programme, VTR Editor and Video Lighting. It also won a Royal Television Society Award for Technique.
As noted, an adapted extract from the 3rd movement of Healy Hutchinson's Carol Symphony became the opening and closing music for The Box of Delights. But an incidental score was also required, and therefore the phone rang in the legendary BBC Radiophonic Workshop.
Roger Lim of the workshop had worked with the director before. Apparently Rennie Rye would take around a week to cut each episode into shape. Then, when the edit of each episode was complete, he would visit Roger with a VHS cassette. They'd discuss music, where it should be and what it should achieve. Roger then spent a day or two putting together a plan for a rough score and also writing out parts. Around the 5th day, instrumentalists were invited into the studio. The music is scored for harp, French horn, flute, clarinet, bass clarinet, an Oberheim synthesizer and radiophonics. The music became an essential part of the success of the series. There is heightened menace in the Abner Brown sequences and wonderment in the magical sections. Building a snowman is happy and jolly, while Hearn is introduced with majesty and grandeur. There is wry comedy and pomp in serving Kay his posset, and there are horrific instrumental screams in the conjuring of the Slave of the Night. After the broadcast of the 2nd episode, the BBC announced a BBC single of the music.
And there's a BBC single of the music from The Box of Delights, which will be available from this weekend.
Despite the promise of availability, it took many weeks to arrive. On a 7-inch single, there were 2 extracts from the Carol Symphony, but no incidental music. There wasn't even a pictorial sleeve. Over 3 decades later, Silver Screen Records released a CD of the original television soundtrack during December 2018, with a double vinyl album available a few months later. It was a release which owed everything to a lucky last-minute rescue by Mark Ayres. Early in 1997, Mark, a composer and audio technician, was asked to consolidate and catalogue the BBC Radiophonic Workshop's extensive library of audio master tapes. After 6 months, he discovered that almost half the anticipated quantity of material was missing. Enquiries eventually revealed that the tapes had been moved from 3 rooms into 1, and when it became obvious that the storage facilities would be too small, it was decided to destroy the tapes which wouldn't fit. Such a large-scale destruction needed special arrangements, however, and these preparations had been overlooked. Mark traced the missing tapes, dumped in a storeroom, and these included the master tapes for The Box of Delights. So now, saved from the skip, over an hour of incidental music is now available on CD, LP and download. Incidentally, it's a pleasure to state that the artwork design for the music is by the exceptionally talented Clayton Hickman. When Clay found out about opening The Box of Delights, he offered to design the front cover, and it's still a thrill for me to look at the fabulous result. Thanks, Clay. The story doesn't end with the 1984 BBC TV version, of course. There's been a score by the composer Robert Stedman to a libretto in which Masefield had a hand. Gareth Jones and John Francis prepared 3 different productions of their musical adaptation in the 1990s. The wonderful Piers Tordy adapted the book as a stage play, which was performed for 2 Christmas seasons at Wilton's Music Hall in London in 2017 and 18. Last Christmas, Two-Faced Dance Company, a contemporary dance group based in Hereford, offered an immersive dance interpretation. But now, it's time to go swift and wrap things up. For Piers Tordy, the novel is the first entirely original children's adventure of the 20th century. We still see the book's influence everywhere today. Neil Gaiman adopts the word scrobble in Neverwhere. Joan Aiken's The Wolves of Willoughby Chase would be unimaginable without The Box of Delights, and Sylvia Daisy Pouncer must find her successor in Roald Dahl's Grand High Witch. Moving portraits and chess pieces playing games admittedly come from the Midnight Folk, but they have strong literary successors within J.K. Rowling's Wizarding World. C.S. Lewis's Narnia and the parallel worlds of Philip Pullman also surely owe something to Masefield. After The Box of Delights, Masefield continued to write for another 3 decades, but there were no further adventures for Kay Harker. Although Masefield had proved resilient to the First World War, the Second devastated his immediate family with the death of his son at the age of 32. It was for others to adapt and transform Masefield's unique blend of fantasy into radio drama, television serial, musical theatre, audiobook, dramatic theatre and contemporary dance. Reinvention and adaptation have brought freshness to the magic, but the original text remains as one of the strangest, enthralling and captivating books ever written by one of the most neglected of writers. If you'd like to learn more, then I may have mentioned there's a book about it. Opening the Box of Delights is available now for a mere £20, published by Darton, Longman and Todd.